Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this event that is hosted by the University of Bath Institute for Policy Research. My name's Peter Allen. I'm a professor of politics here at the university and co-director of the IPR. I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan White. Jonathan is Professor of Politics at the London School of Economics. Jonathan's based in the LSE's European Institute and he's published widely on democracy, the politics of emergency. He's received the British Academy Brian Barry Prize for Excellence in Political Science, and pertinent to tonight, he is the author of In the Long Run, The Future as a Political Idea, which has recently come out in paperback and is available from all places where books are sold. Jonathan and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you for your questions. So please have those ready by the time that comes around. There'll be mics circulating afterwards. Okay, Jonathan, just to kick things off then. The book's been out for about a year now, but what was your initial motivation for writing this book at the time that you wrote it?
Yeah. So I guess it's always interesting to study things that are somehow in crisis in one way or another. And I guess one reason that I thought came out of a course, which I started teaching about 7 years ago, and one reason that I started teaching that course and then started thinking about a book that might come out of it was this, I guess, fairly recurrent, almost commonsensical idea that one encounters, that something about the future is not what it was, that we are somehow more pessimistic than we used to be, or that politics somehow has become more presentist. You see variations on this kind of theme in a number of places. You see opinion polls, again, which often reports that people expect worse conditions for their children and grandchildren rather than better ones, and so on. So out of these little tidbits of empirical material that one encounters very, very regularly through newspapers, the media, and so on, one picks up a kind of sense that, you know, the future is an idea that somehow seems to be met with increasing trepidation in different contexts of society. And that, I guess, coupled with the idea that nonetheless it seemed to be quite politically important, and that maybe historically across modern politics it's been something that's been a sort of reference point for most obviously, I guess, progressive forms of politics that may, as part of an idea of progress, rely on expectations of continuities between the past and the future. But there's also perhaps more generally, maybe it's even a kind of precondition of a certain type of collective action that one develops plans, that one thinks forward in time, and so on. So I had this kind of double sense that on the one hand it seemed like quite an important political thing, and at the same time there seemed to be widespread scepticism of one form or another about the future. Out of this I thought there's material for a course, and out of the course I thought there's material for a book.
Yeah, it is sort of contemporary and timeless at the same time. And that comes to one of the things that really struck me about the book. And you know, I think if you teach politics, particularly to first-year students, one of the debates that, you know, always comes up is that debate between structure and agency. So the extent to which we are agentic, political kind of actors, and we can shape the world that we live in, we can shape the future that's going to be there, or that we're constrained by structures, or at least, you know, what we can do as agents is constrained by structures. And that seems to, like you say, sort of underpin so much political thinking. In terms of the accounts of the future that you find in the sort of history of political thought that you account for in the book, what would you say the balance is roughly between people who see the future in these sort of structural terms or who have more of a agentic bias, if we want to call it that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I guess my starting point would be that the future becomes a theme. Historians would often locate this in the 17th, 18th century, but to think about the future politically is something that itself has a history, and that perhaps it becomes a theme when there is some sense of agency. In other words, on your dualism there, that if one really minimizes the scope for human agency, perhaps like religious ways of seeing the world might do, or might see the scope for human agency, if not null, then somehow constrained by forces much larger than humanity, then to that degree there's much less reason to think about the future. You may feel that maybe things don't change, that sort of to think about the future is already perhaps to expect that it might be different from the present and the past. So insofar as one might historicise this and say, well, up until the 17th, 18th century, this kind of expectation of continuity, and I'm thinking of historians like Reinhard Koselleck that go into great depth on this kind of theme, to that degree, perhaps people only start thinking about the future when they think maybe it's to some degree makeable. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to go entirely in the direction of saying it's all agency and that structure is kind of left behind as we enter a modern world of future thinking. Because, of course, and I mentioned progress earlier on as an idea, of course, there is a sense in which, I guess, one of the ways that people have tried to almost cope with that great uncertainty that comes when you start to turn your gaze to the future, to things that might be different, you start to wonder, well, what other parameters one sets for that? There is clearly a sense in which that can be kind of bewildering. Anything's possible. Anything, especially think of the revolutions of the 18th century, which were almost a kind of first-hand lesson in how things could change very rapidly and unpredictably. And I think that is almost a kind of paralyzing thought politically. And so I think what you see then, especially towards the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, is a kind of effort to recuperate some notion of structure, and perhaps the idea of progress offers a little bit of that for some of its early interpreters. So the idea of progress can, of course, be read in many different ways, but I think a recurrent way is that it's some kind of law of history. It's a kind of regularity that, just as in the past things have changed in the long run for the better, and in earlier thinkers of progress, I think they would have bundled this together to mean technology, but also moral progress, epistemic progress, that somehow it all comes together. So this is a kind of law that can be projected into the future, and that maybe the future is not quite so unbearably open, that there is a sort of a sense that we have parameters within which to work. Maybe even progress doesn't perhaps rely on human agency. Maybe it happens behind our backs. So if you think of invisible hand arguments like Adam Smith, theories of the market, where people pursuing their own private interest are nonetheless contributing to a wider public good, they're contributing to something like progress. I guess with the very idea of an invisible hand, you've got some notion that there's a kind of structure there that is bigger than the intentions of particular human agents, and that it's kind of taking care of progress for you, that the unbearable openness and kind of responsibility that might come with thinking that people make the world as they would like to see it, that some of that is relieved with these kind of stories of a second wave of stories about structure here in the form of progress. Think of Marxism. Clearly we can debate how deterministic Marxism is or isn't, but again, picking up themes of constraints on agency.
Yeah, and part of that seems to me to be that sort of idea that, like you're saying, how things can change. And I think it's that sort of distinction between, a process and an event. So certain philosophers, Alain Badiou, for example, talk about, the idea of an event being this sort of sudden rupture of a system. I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about the way that you've sort of encountered the different approaches to thinking about the future that make that kind of distinction between something that maybe is going to happen all of a sudden, and then things that are going to take longer. And then maybe, when I was just reading the book again recently, I was thinking, actually maybe all political events are kind of a bit of both. So something like Brexit, it felt like a revolution on the day, and then of course you enter this tedious, sort of long legislative process. And maybe that's also something we can come back to later about that sort of idea of democracy being a recipe to disappoint people potentially. But yeah, coming back to that point then, so event-based versus sort of process-based visions of the future. Would you kind of accept that characterization?
Yeah, I think one can probably go quite a long way with it. I mean, a lot of people thinking about when does the future become a theme in politics are tying arguments closely to the experience of revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. And to that extent, you might say in these kinds of arguments, while you can tell a longer incremental story of the emergence of future thinking out of post-Reformation changes in belief, the sense that people are no longer living in the last days, that there's a kind of spaciousness of time that can accommodate thinking about the future. Nonetheless, I think a lot of accounts would emphasize that if that's a kind of theoretical idea, it becomes more concrete with the experience of events like revolutions that throw things up in the air and sort of affirm that kind of malleability of the world, the way in which what one generation inherits from the previous is not necessarily how it's going to pass on the world to the next. I guess later events sometimes drawn into a similar account. You often read the notion that, to stick with progress, that the idea of progress meets its crisis with the great wars of the 20th century, perhaps specifically with atomic weapons, the idea of contingency, the possibility of mistakes. Clearly, increasingly, I guess, again, we think about what it is to live in a nuclear age, and I guess increasingly not just in awareness of weapons, but in awareness of great powers led by individuals with a great deal of discretion at the top of the pyramid. And I guess the combination of those two things, individuals and great power and weapons, one way of kind of reading the significance of that is that it's possible to have events from which there is no possibility of later correction if things go wrong. In other words, if the madman presses the nuclear button, then that's an irreversible event, and one that may happen with a madman with kind of almost a lack of explanation, with the idiosyncrasies of individual action. And, that's potentially a kind of a death knell, at least to ideas of progress as a law. In other words, I think one can retain ideas of progress as a kind of horizon, something that one finds orientation for in politics, something one tries to achieve, maybe doesn't feel that has ever really been consistently achieved in the past, but it can be something that you believe is something to take orientation from. But the idea of progress as a law, as something one can rely on, clearly takes a bit of a battering once you have events that seem to reveal that we can destroy the world overnight, and that there are people with the power to do so unchecked by countervailing powers. Climate change obviously brings up similar things, although perhaps that's more of a process that becomes visible through events. So you've got a kind of interesting meeting point there between the thing that we can only experience through events and perhaps science, but that becomes tangible to us through events, and yet plays out over a slightly longer timescale than the nuclear button scenario.
Yeah, so it seems to me, I can't imagine who you're talking about by the madman with the nuclear button, but,
More than one, probably.
Well, unfortunately, yeah, they are proliferating at quite an alarming rate. But, democracies, I suppose, we sort of would hope that they're not going to be the madman. But then, I was thinking last week about the way that this Labour government, it looks like they've given the go-ahead to this third runway at Heathrow. And actually, of course, looking back from the distance of 200 years in the future, maybe, our grandchildren's grandchildren will think, they were the madmen, because everyone in Parliament who, or whatever, Rachel Reeves, for example, maybe democracies could also be the mad people in the long run, I suppose.
Absolutely, and I guess also democracies in a certain condition in which all those ways in which power is depersonalized and turned into the stuff of collectives like parties, things that are meant to define themselves by common commitments, ideas, insofar as those things are weak and power is much more concentrated in the hands of smaller groups who maybe are operating on a much more interpersonal basis rather than through collective kind of party constitutions, ideas that are meant to define what they're doing, programmatic agendas and so on. If, even in a democracy, power is often wielded by individuals and sort of supporting aides, where power doesn't perhaps well correlate with what we like to think of the structures of power, institutions, collectives like parties. If it's actually wielded in slightly different ways, then of course the difference between democracies and other forms of political regime may not be so great after all. So I think it's partly that, democracies can make mistakes, there's no doubt about that. Even democracies run by ponderous parties taking everything through various forms of intra-party deliberation and democracy, they can make mistakes. That's almost, I guess, definitional of democracy, that it's a regime form that allows for choice and therefore the possibility of error, however one construes that. But I guess all the more so if what we're dealing with is maybe something that's again all about concentrated power, about personal discretion, people that maybe act first and think later, and then democracy may not be any type of rejoinder to the concerns that one might have about powerful people and their impulses.
Well, and politicians who want to win elections, and people who have lots of money to spend on helping them to do that, I suppose. So one of the other things that struck me about the book is, in some ways, you're sort of arguing for a kind of old-fashioned social democracy, and I'm not saying old-fashioned in a kind of derogatory way. This was the sort of model that is probably familiar to many people now, mainly through textbooks, right? So it's that idea of individuals being able to participate in collectives and exert democratic control over leaders through these kinds of organisations. So in the last couple of chapters of the book, you talk about, you'd like to see more things like workplace democracy, for example, strengthening of unions, other kinds of associations. So while we can acknowledge that, those kind of periods weren't inclusive of lots of people, so they weren't perfect by any stretch, it did feel like maybe they were periods when individuals could feel that their the small kind of amount of democratic power they had was actually working. They could get governments to respond, they could somehow kind of control them. But that, I think it's fair to say, has sort of, dissolved a bit. I don't think people do feel like that anymore. And it feels like that must be such a big part now of how people think about the future, that kind of vision of democracy is something that individual people can control. I mean, this comes back to what we've just been talking about, really. How do you think that story of a kind of decline of social democracy that maybe was a high point for what we would think of as contemporary modern democracy, how does that tie, the death of that tie, or at least the temporary death, hopefully, of that tie into a bigger story about how people have come to think about the future, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the themes of the book is that while we often hear calls to be more long-termist, to take a longer view on the future, again, this kind of recurrent sense that both as societies and as political leaders, people have become somehow more immediate in their focus. The invitation is often to kind of lift your eyes and take the bigger perspective. One of the themes of the book is that it's not really it's not a psychological thing. It's not simply a kind of active imagination that shapes whether people think about the future. But to think about the future requires organizations, institutions that make it credible, make it convincing to think about the future. So, for example, if I'm concerned about economic inequality, or if I'm concerned about questions of climate change mitigation, of course, at one level, these are things that you can think about the future and just sort of project as an individual how you would like to see the world better than it is, or how you fear it going if nothing is done to intervene with the course of events. But it seems to me that what's interesting historically about forms like parties, unions, these collectives are things which, I guess, ideally are meant to be sort of indefinite in their lifespan. Yeah. Things that could last longer than the individual lifespan. This may sound slightly romantic, but I think for people that join political parties because they believe in the ideas rather than because they want to have some kind of access to offices and so on, I think it's often attached to some notion of a cause or something that will continue and that you want to contribute to, but it's a sort of indefinite cause. And I think institutions, organizations are the things that kind of are the vehicles, if you like, of that sensibility. If you can identify something like a socialist party, a green party, a liberal party, whatever your political persuasion is, and somehow invest certain hopes in such a entity as something that maintains a program into the future, then you have much more reason to think about the future and try and see it as something that you can actually affect, to see it as open rather than simply something which is presented by larger power forces of society and economy as kind of determined for you. So I think the link that you're getting at in the question is that for me the capacity to think about the future has a lot to do with political empowerment, and that this comes through associations like the kind that you're mentioning. And conversely, to the extent that we live in in a world today where it's all about emergencies and the kind of the felt urgency of the moment and the need to kind of resolve things in the here and now, no time for mistakes and so on, while that partly has clear drivers which are to do with material factors of climate change, economy and so on, it's also, I think, a reflection of the weakening confidence that comes when you can't identify collectives, parties, unions, things that are going to stand and maintain for some type of political cause that you have reason to identify with. So that for me is the link. As these kinds of entities start to become weaker and less credible as sources of kind of organized future thinking and future making, then conversely people have reason to sort of step back from those more not necessarily optimistic, but even just to engage with the kind of the larger stakes of the future that I think politics inevitably throws up. So that's why, as you say, for me there is that kind of link between the organs of social democracy as we have known them, they're fading over time, over the latter 20th century especially, and the kind of diagnosis about the future that I began with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also that I suppose that you get this in the sort of chaotic politics of, I was just thinking when you were speaking there about the guy who tried to assassinate President Trump last year, everyone was sort of like, what's his politics? And it turned out to be this completely, the variety within there was mad. But of course, that's because these kinds of associations that would have previously structured, I suppose, people's sort of entry into the political world just don't exist in quite the same way. But
there's a discipline aspect, I guess, to an association. I mean, discipline in the positive sense is kind of almost the enabling of the discipline that comes with sharing thoughts with others, with having some kind of collective sense of what you stand for. And the more you have that stripped away, then, as you say, then there's a kind of volatility that comes to every individual as a political actor, because it's more about individual train of thoughts, accordingly.
Yeah, and then you end up with situations like that guy got himself into. But you've written a lot about political parties in your previous work, and I just want to stick with this theme of association, because it seems to me that even towards the end of the book, I don't think it's a pessimistic book at all, but you actually seem pretty optimistic about a return to association, I guess. And I just wanted to ask you, where's the source of your optimism? Because I look around and I sort of think, it's like that old joke of how do you get to Dublin? Well, I wouldn't start from here, sort of thing. It's kind of, if we were to set up a set of conditions that were going to prompt association again, I don't think I did this. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone is now a quarter of a century old, and it doesn't feel like many of the patterns that he identified have changed. In fact, they probably got worse through technology and various other things. Why are you such an optimist about this, Jonathan?
Well, I think, firstly, it would certainly be an optimism of the will rather than the intellect, because I am certainly susceptible to less optimistic arguments, as we might distill them from empirical observation and just everyday experience. But if there is something that kind of gives one reason to be optimistic rather than simply a kind of almost moral assertion that one must be optimistic, then I guess, what's interesting, I think, is that there are occasionally moments of reversal where you see that these types of models of the programmatic party, relatively accessible to those that might want to join it, still has, I think, a little bit of appeal in the wider society still. I think in this country, the Corbyn period offered a certain evidence for that, insofar as certainly people are willing to join a party in large numbers and reverse trends of declining membership and triple the size of the Labour Party. Also insofar as it brings people out to vote in larger numbers, particularly in 2017 for the party than had been for several elections beforehand. And I guess, this can, I think, be seen as a function also of a kind of reversal of the tendency away from the decline of programs towards a kind of more personalised form of politics, towards a kind of a politics of competence, of problem solving, of leaders presenting themselves as safe pairs of hands. I think we're much back to that now with Starmer. I think this is very much where we are again with the current Labour Party. But I think what you saw in that period between 2015 and 2019 is a party, to some degree of necessity, not having a leader that can really play the charismatic card particularly well, but I think very much also of design presenting itself once again as something more like a programmatic cause and trying to tie particular policies to a larger kind of concept of what it stood for. Because I think there's a sense, it's not that contemporary parties don't think about the future at all. There is plenty of willingness to set targets for decarbonisation, to set particular goals. Missions, of course, is the key word of the current Labour government. This willingness to sort of approach the future in terms of particular elements and concrete targets or threats, I think is still very much there. But the willingness to approach the future in terms of a kind of more general vision, a kind of a programme, I think is much rarer. And what you saw in that period in this country, to some degree mirrored in other European countries in the 2010s, to some degree mirrored in the Sanders movement in the US, is a kind of slight reversal of a wider trend of the decline of parties as these types of formation and their sort of disaggregation into individuals' particular policies rather than a larger programmatic politics. So if I have to distill optimism from something, I guess it would be that even if I accept the general tendencies that all political scientists will tell you about the decline of parties, of unions, of the kind of concentration of power at the top of these types of organisations, I think when they fall into the hands of a larger membership base, you see that there's still something intriguing and appealing about this model of doing politics.
I'd agree, although I think, one of the lessons from the Corbyn years potentially was that the professionals within the party just were not going to allow that to happen, which is interesting. And there's a line in the book that I'm going to quote at you, which was, you say the issue is that calculation is the priority of the powerful while imagination is left to the marginalised. And it did feel that, even with Trump in some sense, obviously coming from a totally different sort of political ideology, there is that sense of a desire for something that isn't quite so calculated. In the book you make the distinction between the future as calculation and the future as imagination. And I suppose that it's about who can tap into that sort of that appetite, I guess, whether they're on the left or the right.
Absolutely, and I think as you're indicating, there is a sense in which the contemporary far right, perhaps especially, does try to tap into that sensibility with kind of calls for great change, this type of disruptive outlook, the willingness to be very unpredictable and thereby almost kind of performatively show that you're not just more of the same, but that you are going to do something transgressive and therefore authentic and therefore something that is a departure from these more technocratic forms of politics that we might be familiar with. This is clearly something that you see on the Trumpian right in the US. And I don't think one can treat it as a genuine rejoinder to what I'm saying, because I don't think it really does tend to produce a coherent program. It doesn't, I think, tend to try and garner support by the shape of a larger vision of the future. Its message is really big change is going to come, which may be a sufficient message when people are kind of consumed with a sense of unbearable stasis. But not just that big change is going to come, but I, as the Trumpian individual, am a kind of heroic persona that can enact that change, that is big enough for that change, and that you can kind of trust me because I'm going to do what I want to do rather than what I have to do. Yeah. So occasionally in the book, and certainly in my previous book, I talk about the distinction between the kind of politics of necessity and of volition. And I think a lot of centre-left, also centre-right politics has fallen into this trap of justifying everything it does in terms of one or another kind of necessity. Either the need of economic reason or what you have to do in an emergency, including the pandemic, to kind of to shore up an unstable situation. If you justify policy not because you want to do it, but because you have to do it, I think you become quite vulnerable to a critique that says, no, I stand for what I want to do, a kind of contrarianism. It doesn't necessarily have a particular vision, it doesn't necessarily have a particular idea of the future that it want to convey, but a contrarian that says, I'm going to do things the way I want them to be done. people don't have to believe that Trump is going to be making their lives significantly better. They may just want to identify with someone that promises that kind of figure of agency in a wider context of those that kind of disavow their agency. So yeah, I think one way to think about the present is that this kind of evacuation of the future that one might say, that one sees on the centre left, right, creates a kind of space for far-right politics to thrive, and to thrive because it doesn't also have a clear sense of the future. It can thrive on unpredictability and chaos, make a weapon out of unpredictability. And so the only way that one might try and step out of that kind of tendency towards an ever more self-empowering far right would be if the left could recapture something of this promise of change, of agency towards the future, and sort of step away from that kind of more target-driven, threat-driven mode of doing decision-making, which I think it's fallen into for some time. So yeah, I think that the right is the beneficiaries, and of course its ideas of the future are much less demanding. I mean, a lot of what we call fascism over the 20th century, I think, is a kind of politics of almost deliberate inconsistency, of surprise, of incoherence. Some of the book talks about the aesthetics of futurism in the 1910s, 20s, where this aesthetics that very much feeds into fascism, especially Italian fascism, is all about confounding expectations, being unpredictable, putting the critic on the back foot. I think this is quite foundational to fascism. Fascism is many things, and one would not want to dismiss the kind of the material interest that it serves. But one thing it is, I think, also, is a kind of politics of surprise and of making sure that critics don't quite know where to focus their energies on you. This is something that prospers in a world of crisis, of unpredictability, and it's sort of self-fulfilling because these same figures create that sense of unpredictability and crisis by the way in which they engage with it.
Absolutely. So, if you think about what's happening in the US this past week, Trump and Musk have come in and they're behaving very much as if they're in an emergency, or that they inherited an emergency, which they didn't. While the Democrats are behaving as if there isn't an emergency, which there is. And of course, part of politics is knowing what, when you're in one and not in the other. Notwithstanding, your critique here, I sort of wonder that at what point do you think actually it does make more sense for the Democrats to stop waiting for, mummy to come and break up the fight and actually get down and dirty in that emergency politics? Or, ultimately, do you think that's just sort of kind of just going to breed more and more?
I think the problem is that they've already been trying that. I mean, I think that a lot of the last US election was exactly phrased as an emergency, actually from both sides, of course. In other words, I think from the right, phrased by Trump himself as a kind of the final battle, the final election. Or think of the way Musk talks about Britain and the riots here in the summer, kind of portending civil war. You might say civil war again carries this kind of notion of finality, ultimacy to it. Yeah. So certainly you get that from the right, but I think also from the left in the US election, a keen willingness to portray this as almost like the last election. Of course, not without reason. I mean, the stakes are high, there's no doubt. But really to boil everything down to the moment of the campaign and the future of democracy, rather than the kind of the longer political programs that one might hope to pursue should one win the election, that would have some kind of transformative impact for ordinary people in everyday life and that would yield material dividends for them. I think, for me, it's not so much that when will the Democrats in the US start to realize that they are in emergency, but when will they couple that sense of urgency, which I think is not going to go away and perhaps shouldn't go away, but couple that with exactly a willingness to engage with the further future and the kind of program that has to be put out there if people are going to have a reason to vote in a context where they may not think that much is going to change in the immediate term. They need a kind of a longer story of a cause, something that's going to really change things radically over time, rather than simply a story of why they need to vote to save democracy in this election.
So, got a couple more minutes. So I just wanted to ask you something. Thinking, obviously, we all teach young people at the university, and a lot of that sort of discussion that we have in class and about the future, kind of in everything that we do, is sort of always is on that borderline of sort of fatalism and then maybe a kind of lesser pessimism. So it's not exactly the most optimistic sort of thing, but I was kind of thinking for people who in these situations end up doing things that they didn't think they would do. So you think about these sort of people who are being arrested for gluing themselves to things for Just Stop Oil, for example. They seem to have to combine, at the level of the individual, a kind of mix of being optimistic that what they are doing can change something, while obviously believing that things are so bad that this is the only option that they are going to do it. And it feels like that's quite easy to see at the level of the individual, right? You can sort of kind of understand what it would be like to hold those two thoughts. But at the level of the society, it feels like we're also sort of doing the same thing, although on the outside of it, it does actually look a bit more optimistic. You know, we kind of all continue to pay into pensions, for example. Most of us pay our taxes. Most of us don't break the law or whatever. If you were looking at a society and you were thinking, is that society heading towards fatalism? What do you think you'd be seeing? What is it you would be looking for? What would the telltale signs of that be?
Well, I guess one form clearly can be rates of voting, as well as rates of associating with the kind of parties, unions that we were talking about beforehand. But I think there is a sense, I mean, clearly political scientists have often debated in what spirit do people vote. Do they vote with the future in mind, or do they vote with the past in mind? Is voting retrospective or prospective? Some people say it is or it should be only backward looking, and therefore that democracy can cope quite fine with people who are not at all interested in the future, as long as they're willing to pass judgment on how did these people in government do over the last 5 years. I think that is a misleading account of what actually gets people willing to vote or not willing to vote, and I think there is a much stronger prospective aspect to voting, and conversely, when people have little to hope for, little to identify with, the non-voting is what many of them will fall into. And of course, the people that don't vote may be often those that perhaps would benefit most from parties that would listen to their interests. If they drop out of the process, then you get this kind of vicious circle of parties that ignore certain kind of interests because they don't make themselves heard in an electoral context. So I think non-participation in politics is one of the key ways in which that fatalism might express itself. As you said, with the Just Stop Oil or the Extinction Rebellion, of course, there are good reasons why people might give up on representative democracy, not out of a spirit of fatalism, but out of a kind of a spirit of almost hyper-agency, or the need for agency, the sense that it's only by stepping away from representative democracy that we can have any reason for anything other than fatalism. So there is something, I think, powerfully kind of optimistic tied in with, as you say, that sense of kind of the last chance that goes with these types of direct action. It's very powerful in that respect. But part of my book is to try and say that I don't think that these moves away from representative democracy ultimately can work, because if you disengage with the power of the state, and if you are simply reacting to the state rather than trying to control the state, then ultimately you're just too much on the back foot. I don't say this because these people are probably unaware of this point. I'm sure many of them would at some level agree with this, and say nonetheless we've got to do something, and that's that's an entirely plausible line of reasoning. But I don't think the move around representative democracy is ever ultimately going to be a sufficient strategy. One still has to engage with the structures of the state and representative democracy, and therefore I think it does matter whether people still join parties, vote, and so on. These, I think, still are the basic conditions of being able to influence things in politics.
And just my final question then actually relates to this. So at the end of the book, you talk about sort of supplements or alternatives to representative democracy. So you discuss sortition, citizens' assemblies, people might be familiar with. It felt to me that you sort of ultimately, you don't fully endorse that, because it doesn't give that sort of big picture kind of temporally extended kind of commitment to a political vision that you think is so critical here. Would that be a fair characterization?
I think that's right. I mean, I think first to engage with their advocates. I mean, some people would say representative democracy has become so beholden to special interests, to concentrations of power, that basically there is no scope for imagining anything different from what we have at present, for imagining a different kind of future. that the system is basically just kind of paralyzed. And so the line of reasoning might say, what's attractive about sortition, about elements of luck in politics, in other words, random selection of representatives, is that you break that kind of sedimentation of special interests in politics, that you can kind of reopen the future in the sense that you can have the scope for policies that are different from the existing distribution of power in society, because random selection is hard for anyone to control. Yeah. So that would be the argument for them. My concern would simply be that while at any particular moment, if you convene an assembly of people in a room like this and get them to debate some aspect of public policy, they might indeed come up with radical and interesting suggestions. But you do the same thing in a few months' time or a few years' time with, again, a randomly selected group of people, you're very unlikely to get some kind of cumulative project that spans those different moments of assembly. Yeah. The whole point of random selection is that it's unpredictable and therefore probably not cumulative. And so but what you probably get then is a kind of a very episodic, pointillistic form of politics. Big ideas, but then replaced by big ideas, and then big ideas again. I think what's interesting about the party political model of the 20th century, whatever its deep failings of the present, is it at least aspires to that idea of the cumulative project, the thing that maintains some kind of continuity or program across time and tries to contribute to something that is ongoing with each different moment of assembly fundamentally starting from scratch all over again. So I think the party as a cumulative project is something that is a kind of precondition of radical politics, whereas a series of randomly selected assemblies, they're little moments of radicalism, but without the kind of the continuous organisation to back them up. Now, I know you can organise these things in many different ways, so I'm speaking rather quickly here, but that would be one family of reservations that one might have about this kind of alternative to party politics.
Yeah. So we're just as unlikely to get HS2 built with a series of citizens' assemblies, perhaps. Okay, right, time for some questions. Sophia. If you could just wait, everyone could just wait for the microphone to get to you before you start speaking, and then you are being recorded if you speak on this. Yeah.
Good to know. Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jonathan, for this very interesting exchange. You talked quite a lot about institutions today, and you also talk about institutions in the book as well, and you highlight the importance of institutions for what you call future regarding politics, which I think is a very nice way to talk about politics. Now, one of the examples that you return quite a lot to the book is climate change. And I think that one of the challenges today is how we design institutions that can effectively govern this unfolding process. And I think we both share here a skepticism for things like climate assemblies. So with this in mind, my question is, what institutional changes do you think are needed in order to make this shift from the kind of short-termism that we experience today, especially in climate politics? Probably short-termism, I would say, characterize democracies more broadly. So what are the institutional changes we need to move towards a long-term approach to sustainability, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think you very nicely put your finger on one of the concerns that a lot of people have about climate change, is that it's something that requires thinking about the future, and therefore perhaps a sense of the tragedy of the present being this incapacity to think, but also to organise on a scale commensurate with the problem at hand. I think obviously one of the parallel concerns that a lot of people might have about existing responses to climate change would be that they are often very much from the top down. They are perhaps quite technocratic. They're often focused on quantifiable metrics, which I think often points towards expertise, towards modes of shaping policy, which are very much in the hands of those who monitor the numbers, conceive the targets in the first place, and have the capacity to change policy in light of them. So I think if one's thinking about alternative ways of responding to climate change, it's not just about how does one think on a temporal scale, but how does one couple that with a kind of participatory approach to politics that seems to be quite often absent in things like ideas of a green transition? It's, of course, extremely difficult, and many people would say it's made more difficult because we have deadlines that we need to respect when responding to this. If you take seriously the idea that there are certain things that have to be done within a window of 6 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever, then even to pose your question about institutional innovations might seem somewhat decadent, because institutions take time to be developed and so on. So I think at some point one does have to think about institutional changes, and that means to some degree not so much refusing climate deadlines, but realizing that whether they are hit or missed, there is always a further future that needs to be engaged with, and that one can't afford just to kind of take that out of the equation just because it's beyond a sort of window of time in which one needs to do certain things in line with the climate science. I guess in terms of formats of organization, I still gravitate generally to forms of internationalism through unions and parties again. In other words, forms that were pioneered at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in response to problems that were not entirely dissimilar, that perhaps didn't have the against the clock element, but did have the aspect that they were transnational things to do with inequality, for example. You couldn't really respond to the concentrations of late 19th century capitalism without thinking transnationally and trying to organize workers across political boundaries. Internationalism of workers' movements, unions, parties was, I think, the only really viable response to that, and of course didn't work. I mean, it met the First World War, and then likewise in the 1920s. So the kind of things that I think may be necessary are kind of things that may not work. But I think that doesn't mean that the alternatives are more likely to suffice. So alternatives to more technocratic forms of green transitions thinking, I think, are probably closer to some notion of a Green New Deal that is a wide, encompassing program of policies that goes beyond simply decarbonisation towards rethinking how societies are structured, how cities are structured, about who pays the costs of climate change adaptation and so on. These kind of big, ambitious forms of politics, I think, were there in the kinds of Green New Deals that emerged towards the end of the 2010s, although they were kind of technocratized and turned into things like the European Commission's Green Deal, which was, again, something much more close to the technocratic model of target setting. So they're easy to co-opt into something that looks rather different and something that I think is going to leave public opinion behind and therefore will ultimately not work. And they're very difficult to make work. But elusive as they may be, I think it's that kind of model of internationalism around broad programmatic agendas that promise something quite different from the way things are at the present. I think that's the only viable organizational response in town here, even though probably has to accept that it's pretty hard to get off the ground. Yeah.
Thank you. My question comes from a point of double ignorance. I haven't read your book, unfortunately, and I'm in psychology and not politics. But when I was hearing you speaking about the future, I sometimes got more of a sense that you were talking not about the future in itself, but the future as a trajectory of change, a pattern from the past to the future, especially ideas of progress, but you use examples of like you might join a party because there's a policy that you want to maintain. So I guess my question goes back to kind of the very title of this talk. How much do you think the future is a political idea in its own right that we can treat as people think about the future? And how much is its importance embedded in an idea of the past and a trajectory of change in which progress is one, Trump's golden age would be another, ideas of endless cycles or maintenance. There are lots of patterns of potential trajectories. So future on its own versus that kind of relational idea of past to future.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think ideally it always does have that connection to, and perhaps even accent on thinking about what tendencies in the present does one endorse, does one want to see nurtured, does one want to see prosper, and what does one want to see extinguished. And you might say, well, this doesn't really need a concept of the future so much. This needs simply taking sides within a kind of moving present. And I think one of the dangers of kind of futurology sometimes is precisely to kind of detach the thinking about the future from the world that we inhabit, to kind of treat it as a sort of a place of alterity where things can be entirely different, kind of a utopian in a bad sense, where it simply kind of imagines the ideal without a sense of how that could possibly emerge from the familiar. So I think there is a danger of treating the future as a theme detached from trying to find futures latent or emerging in the present. Of course, on the other hand, I guess the danger would be that sometimes the present doesn't offer a great deal to latch onto. And maybe, whereas, 19th century Marxists might have felt that it was sufficient to identify tendencies in capitalism that would lead towards next stages of socioeconomic change, and that the scope for agency was sort of to nudge them along and to find ways to bring them into being and to accelerate them and so on. Quite possibly we live in an age where that's just not available to us so much, that kind of confidence that might come with identifying something in the present and seeing this is kind of the future in waiting. I think a lot of people look to the present and say, well, if the future is somewhere in the present and it's in waiting, then that's awful. That's a kind of apocalyptic thought rather than an optimistic thought. And perhaps it's then that you need to kind of recuperate some of that utopian spirit in the sense of willingness to imagine a future that is kind of radically different from the present, and maybe that is not a probable future, is an implausible future. I think the kind of the politics of the improbable cause, perhaps even the lost cause, the willingness to get behind something that you don't treat as a plausible extrapolation from the present, I think is kind of especially necessary when the world looks pretty grim. So I think I generally agree with your suggestion that ideally one meets the future without going on banging on about the future, but rather thinking about what is the shape of things as they are and what do I want to identify with, what do I want to continue. But maybe that's a counsel of perfection in a world where you've got to kind of think quite radically different from the way we see things as they are at present.
James.
Thank you. I also haven't benefited from reading the book, so this may be covered. But I'm interested to hear a little bit more of your thinking about intergenerational politics. And I'm not just thinking of political calculus of how many older people vote and how many younger people vote, or about how our visions of the future change as we get older, perhaps. I'm also thinking about changes in the kinds of mental models of the future that younger people have as moulded by that technology and other factors.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think one thing to emphasize there is that we should be very wary, and maybe I've sort of implied that one could speak this way. One should be very wary of suggesting that societies in a kind of general sense have a way of thinking about the future. And of course, early on I was saying, well, crisis of the future, maybe people's reluctance to think about the future, but these things, of course, are very unevenly distributed. So one route into that would be to talk about class differences. There's some interesting empirical research that says that the very willingness to project forward in time is something that you don't find amongst those in very precarious economic conditions. Precarious employment, for example, where the capacity to make plans may seem a bit ridiculous when you don't know if you've got your job in a few weeks from now, or in very consuming jobs where you're working so hard that you don't have the time for the reflection. You might say there's a kind of a deliberative aspect to thinking about the future, that when material conditions are very oppressive, you just don't have that luxury to even to pose these questions. So there's a class angle on this that would say that it's not that societies have a particular outlook on the future. There are groups of people within societies that see the future in different ways. And although their numbers may change in different moments and that you may get more pessimism, more widespread across more groups in society at particular moments. Nonetheless, we need to be attentive to differences. And clearly another way into that would be then the generational approach that you raised, that there may be generational differences in how people see the future. A question that I often get, and I think it's one you sort of preempted, people say, well, are you really surprised that that story of kind of declining confidence in the future, willingness to engage in the future can be told about societies today, because ultimately aren't today societies of aging populations? And aging populations, you might say, are ones in which more people live in awareness of their own mortality. And perhaps that, you might say, again, commonsensically, why would such populations have reason to think about a longer term if their own lifespan is something that maybe on the average there's less of their life ahead of them than there was behind them? I think that's an entirely misleading way to think about it. In other words, I would be very sceptical of the idea that as one simply arrives at old age, one becomes short-termist, less interested in kind of longer-term considerations. People are socially embedded. They are connected to other members of their family, but they also may have ideological commitments to causes that, again, are lifetime transcending, that go beyond their own particular individual temporal horizons. And so, to put it crudely, an aging population is perhaps a population in which more people have grandchildren to worry about, and therefore have more, in some sense, invested in the future than they might do in a population with a different demographic profile. So, at the level of simply distributions of age, I would be sceptical that an aging population has any particular implications for this relationship to the future that I'm interested in. But of course, there are other aspects of this. It's not just about how old people are, but as you said, maybe different age groups experience the world differently, have different familiarities with technology. And the historians of generationalism as a way of thinking about the world in terms of generations, they would often say, well, this often comes from technology, that people started to think about the world in terms of generations and relations between generations in the light of technological differences that make the young somehow have a different set of skills from their parents because they use different technology. So people who are digital natives, for example, or in a previous generation who grew up with home computers, they just see the world in a very different way from their parents and grandparents, and that sense of generational divide comes through technological change and social change and the experience of dislocation. So I think, generational differences certainly play into differences in how people experience the world and how people do or don't feel that they are inhabiting the same world as others. But I think the point I would want to underscore, I'm not a demographic determinist. I don't think that simply age distributions in the population fundamentally shapes the time horizons that are available politically for people to mobilize populations around. Old people can care about the further future just as young people can.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question. Someone did just indicate the woman in the middle, yeah. Great, thank you.
Hi, my question is about the role of the non-political actors in politics, so namely like social movements and academia. So if you think about social movements being a channel for like the civil society to raise demands, to actually trying to influence politics in a way, like throughout, not only in voting, but throughout like the term. But in terms of academia, what we see in the US at the moment, like talking about, I'm from gender studies, and you see this being weaponized by Trump. So what do we do with the data that we produce, or what we do in terms of like policy suggestion, policy design, when a government is actually neglecting to see what has been produced in academia and the role that we have in influencing politics as a whole? So do you think in the future, are we going to have less of a role? Are we going to be less relevant? But how do we keep on being like active in the political system, in this partisan system that is like leaning more towards like far rights and authoritarian governments?
Thank you. I mean, while on one level I'm as bewildered as everyone about what's happening and the world is changing quickly, I can't pretend to have answers here. But maybe one way to think about this particular point would be that I think as academics, we've often thought of our expertise in terms of how it might be picked up by policymakers directly, and that some people like to think of themselves almost as advisors, either advisors in waiting, or perhaps they even do consultancy and like to think that they are directly speaking expertise to power. I think at the best of times, this is a somewhat misleading image of what's going on, because I think power obviously filters out that expertise that it wants to hear, and more challenging forms of expertise were never always likely to be picked up by policymakers just because they had the stamp of science upon them. But maybe what's increasingly clear in the light of the kind of changes that you're describing is just how remote that model of kind of academics have ideas, pass them on to policymakers who dutifully then, as technocrats, turn them into law and so on. That model, I think, is just increasingly slipping away. And therefore, if we want to do something with our expertise, maybe the relevant interlocutor is not some kind of ideal notion of government, but again, the collectives that I was talking about, partisan expertise which is expertise within a framework of certain commitments, for whom the relevant interlocutor is perhaps not the powers of the day, who may not give a crap about what you have to say, but those who are some degree marginalised from power, but nonetheless are trying to contest power. So it's maybe that link between academics, experts, intellectuals, and forms of critical political agency and delivering expertise to them, rather than some notion that you're speaking directly up to the top of the pyramid and trying to convince them to shape policy accordingly. I think maybe that's the switch that has to be internalised increasingly by academics, because I don't think they are talking directly to power, especially as power starts to look more like it looks like in the US by the day.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all very much for coming. Please feel free to have a look at the IPR website. You can find details of future events, and you can sign up to the newsletter. Finally, let us thank Jonathan for coming, and see you all again soon.